We've grown up in a society where discussing our own sexuality with our family, friends, and peers has been taboo and riddled with misconceptions. Many of us feel shame, guilt, and embarrassment around sexuality and intimacy. We are often unaware of how to engage with our own sexuality in a way that is safe for ourselves and for others. Comprehensive sexuality education goes beyond the mechanics of human biology. It equips us with the tools to navigate our relationships with informed consent and respect for personal boundaries, and helps us develop a better understanding of our own minds and bodies. It can radically reduce incidences of sexually transmitted infections and unintended pregnancies, address the endemic issues of gender-based violence, and enhance our self-expression and sexual well-being. Welcome to Safe Spaces, a 4-part series by the Bangalore International Centre in which Dr. Sangeeta Saxena takes us on a deep dive into the realm of sex and sexuality. Dr. Sangeeta is a gynecologist, author, counselor, and activist. She co-founded Enfold India in 2001 to promote gender equity, sexuality, and personal safety education. In this episode, we take a look at the factors that shape our beliefs and behaviors in the bedroom. I am Anisha Tawag, and you're listening to Safe Spaces.
I'm Meghna. I'm 26 years old and I was working in a school for about a year as a school counselor. And the school hadn't had a counselor since I think after COVID happened. So there was a lot of need for counseling and students often felt like they didn't have anybody to go to about a lot of like intimate stuff that they could share with their parents or teachers. So there was this student who came in one day and the first session was about how she was feeling quite lonely in school. She didn't have many friends. It was a little vague the first session. She didn't give me a particular reason as to why the friend sort of has of talking to her. So I tried to explore that. But she also seemed a little like resistant and not very open to talking about what exactly happened. So I thought maybe she won't come again. It just seemed like that. But I told her that, you can reach out anytime. There's a doctor in the school as well. So we often work together. I think the doctor often sends me any students who come to her with like anxiety or panic attack. She used to refer them to me. So this girl had gone to her for some other reason, and the doctor noticed that she had self-harm marks on her wrist. So she brings her to me and tells her to talk to me for a while. Then I asked her what happened and what's going on, are these decent, and try to explore that. And then she started talking about what had actually happened. So she identifies as a bisexual person. That is something that I tried to ask if she was okay with, if that's something that is difficult to identify as in a school. So the school also seems to be a little like, students are a little not open to the queer community. These are not conversations that are encouraged by the principal or the teachers in the school itself. This girl, she said that, no, that is not an issue. I'm quite proud of the fact that I'm bisexual. So girl A, the client who has come to me, she mentioned that there's a girl B that she really has very strong feelings for. And this girl B is a part of the group that both of them belong to. So there are 3 other girls as well. So now this girl A has been trying to sort of ask her out for a while, and then she finally went and asked her if she would be her girlfriend. So girl B is also bisexual, but she's not interested in girl A. According to girl A says that there was some misunderstanding because I thought she had said yes to that proposal to be her girlfriend. So now girl A starts telling everybody in class that she is my wife or she is my girlfriend, and that sort of becomes a big thing. And girl B, I think, was quite a popular girl in class, and girl A is like she calls herself like a very nerdy person. who is very interested in anime and like studies and things like that. So a little different than your normal child. So both of these girls are in the ninth standard. Now this girl realizes that girl A has been saying that she is her wife or girlfriend to other people in the school. This has become quite a big thing. Like this entire group starts isolating her. Like they come and tell her that sorry, we do not want to be friends with you, and they just start ignoring her completely. Like they are quite civil in class, but they don't want to be friends with her. So this is what the girl A comes and tells me in the session that this has happened and they are just outright ignoring me. So I said, is there a conversation you can have with them? Maybe give them a little space and then you can talk about how you can maybe come to a compromise and how you can sort of deal. Girl A seems like not open to talking to them at this point, and then she tells me that she has these self-harm scars, and she tells me that she doesn't intend to stop. Like she's been thinking about doing this more often, and she's having like suicidal ideas. So ethically, I'm supposed to report this to the authorities. Also, her being a minor, I'm supposed to tell her parents as well. But another issue that came up was she's being pressured a lot by the parents to study. So her parents do not let her go even to the neighborhood grocery shops or just go cycling in the society. So there's a lot of pressure from the parents for her to study. She's a very average student, but the parents want her to do a lot better. And she feels she's doing her best. So the parents are also an issue that are leading her to self-harm. So the vice principal is someone who was sort of my support system in school. She was the reason a counselor was brought in. So I go to the vice principal and I tell her that, ma'am, this has been happening. What can we do about it? I would urge you to not call the parents right away because maybe we can have a few sessions, and if she's not doing well after a point, I thought initially I would not tell the vice principal, let me go talk to the class teacher and see if we can sort of make sure she's doing okay for a while before we involve the parents. So the class teacher seems very worried. She's like, no, we have to talk to the vice principal, we have to bring it up. So the vice principal now says that, no, we don't know if this girl will do something on the school premises. So the school at this point I have realized, and rightly so, they are quite concerned about their image. So they are afraid that the girl will do something on school premises and they'll be blamed for that. So they want to involve the parents. And now they have called the parents and they've asked me to go and tell the girl that the parents are coming. So I've gone and told girl A, and she's quite freaked out. She's like, they will not understand, they'll become even worse. They'll be okay initially, they'll understand what you're saying, but it's going to go back to the same thing. So I said, okay, worst case scenario, it's going to be the same. So there's nothing worse that can happen than this. And I sort of trusted that the vice principal will handle it carefully. So the parents came, both the mother and the father, and they seem to be completely unaware that any of this is happening. So they also don't know that she is bisexual. And that is something that I did not want to tell the vice principal or the class teacher or anybody else. So the parents have come, and then the vice principal tells them that this has been happening. And the parents are also quite in denial about the fact that she's self-harming. So they constantly are telling that she must have done it by mistake, maybe with a ruler, or maybe she got like a paper cut or something. But these are not paper cuts. There are like 4 or 5 different marks. The vice principal, meanwhile, has spoken to them and told them that we'll be sending her to counseling regularly and you don't pressure her, let her socialize, let her do things that she likes. So they've come to an agreement about how they will do well at home also with her, make a different schedule for her. So now this girl starts coming to me counseling every day, like during the break hours. And eventually, I think as she starts talking about it more, I think she mostly needed a space to sort of express her frustrations and what she's feeling. So she started doing well after a couple of weeks. So this happened around last year, so 2023, I think around September, October, that time. I started seeing her quite often, like almost every second day during the day. and she started feeling better after a while. After that, what she wanted to do was make a club for people who are going through any emotional issues and also loneliness. So that was something that she was going through quite often. So she often felt lonely even when she was in a group. So she wanted to make a club for people who might be lonely or needed friends who didn't have friends in their own class. So then we sort of started coming up with different activities that we could do in the counseling room itself. So like a group would get together and they some sort of activity, some exercise they would do. Or we also came up with different plans about how maybe on the field we could color a bench like in a different color, and that could be like a space where if somebody's sitting on it, you can feel free to go and have a conversation with them. So that's basically like a place that you can sort of make new friends. She seemed to be doing quite well. She brought a couple of friends with her to the session, and they were talking about how they would make plans during the summer, how they'd have sleepovers. So yeah, I think that was the last time I spoke to her, and she seemed to be doing a little bit.
An important part of the conversation on sexuality and gender is the LGBTQIA plus community. And just from this collection of letters, we know that this is a very diverse community with each identification: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and more, having its own set of experiences and aspirations and desires. But despite this diversity in this community, it's often excluded. But you've done some work with members of the LGBTQIA plus community. So maybe you could just share a little bit about these encounters you've had.
Yeah, our work is not so much with the community, but with the community that excludes them. So our curriculum, right from grade 1 students' curriculum onwards, is inclusive, non-binary. So for instance, for a grade 1, when we talk about their bodies, we say that there are many sexes. It's something that is written on the birth certificate. It's what the doctors look at the baby, where the baby passes urine from, and then usually it's written as female or male. Here for grade 1, we don't use the word intersex variations. That is very consciously done, and we bring it up only in grade 8, because any word that the children hear, quite a few are likely to Google it. And then the images that they may get may not make much of a sense to them. They wouldn't know whom to ask and get contextual answers, age-appropriate, authentic answers. But gender, again, when we talk about gender, we say there are many genders, like girl and boy. That is what we say for grade 1. For grade 5 onwards, we use the word transgender. So the word transgender is introduced for grade 5 and intersex from grade 8 onwards. Any question that a child may ask, for instance, I had a grade 5 student ask me about, so there is female and male, what if somebody has half and half? Now that's the common understanding of intersex, that it is half and half. Well, it's not. Right? Rarely it can be so, but usually it's any development of the genitals of the sexual and reproductive system that doesn't clearly fall into these binary categories of female and male. That is classified as intersex variations. But I didn't want to give him that word, right? So I said, I try to answer in different ways, but finally I said it's a variation of development. He was satisfied with that and he went away. So the answer that was given to him was authentic. It was age appropriate. That is what we need to do for any of these, right? So we have had people share. We do work with people from the community. A trans person was sharing that their 3-year-old niece was asking them, are you a girl or a boy? are you a girl or a boy? So the person said, well, my body is like that of a male, a boy, but in my head and in my heart, I feel like a girl. So she said, oh, but then you are a girl, because two, the head and the heart is more than one, the body. And not only that, after that, she was insisting that everybody in the house call the person by the pronoun that they have, by the name that they have chosen. And otherwise, the threat was, I won't play with you. Right? So we make it complicated, but it isn't really so. If you just say what is so and remove all the judgments around it, you're on sure footing.
When it comes to intersex variations, are we right in understanding it as the physical presentation of sex not corresponding with the sort of chromosomal makeup of the individual? Is that what happens?
No, not really. When we look at the child, and most children, we are able to say clearly, female or male. Now, in many, the development of this entire system, internal as well as external, happens under several factors, chromosomes being one of them. Right? So a person can have XY chromosomes, but have external genitalia looking like a female, complete like a female, would be classified, given assigned the sex female at birth. As they grow older, they'll grow very tall, will develop breasts also, but no hair. No hair and the genitals and the hair that generally bodies with XY chromosomes would develop. That is because their skin is insensitive to testosterone, because a receptor is not there. So in the body, if you measure the testosterone levels, they're high. The bones are responsive, so they grow tall, narrow pelvis. It's just the skin, right? So quite a few intersex variations present at puberty, when the expected changes don't happen. Or sometimes a person may be found to have intersex variations accidentally, like an ultrasound done for something else. And then they find that there are these organs, which we don't really associate with the sex that has been assigned to them. So it's not just chromosomes. There's so many factors.
And this kind of highlights how, unless we do a test, a medical test, we may never know what someone's internal makeup is. Is that something that we can say?
Yeah. Usually puberty is a good threshold when the expected changes would happen, and then they don't. So that's usually there. But then there are a few variations which may never present. Never.
And these might contribute to our perceptions of our sex or gender, our desire.
You can't infer a person's gender identity or their sexual orientation from the physical characteristics of these parts. Right? We do have trans people where the physical characteristics are, as per the book, right? Of either the male or the female. But the gender identity is different, isn't it? Now, it's known that the development of gender identity in them takes more time. Sexual orientation takes more time, right? Because, they really don't have a clear-cut slot available in their surroundings that they can place themselves in, right? Say, oh, I'm homosexual, oh, I'm heterosexual, no. And then any which way, what do you call? These words hetero and homo are probably not really very well suited. And we run into that issue even, say, with a trans person. So a trans person, say, born a male, feels that they're a woman inside, but has always been attracted to women, does gender-affirming surgeries and is with a female. you may say, homosexual. But if the person had remained, they had retained that body, you would say heterosexual. What's going on? So there are some researchers who prefer the word gynophilic, androphilic, and like that. Rather
Talk about sexual preference.
orientation. Yes,
right.
yes.
It kind of clues us into why this conversation needs to begin early on with children. And you mentioned a child asking someone from their own family if they were a boy or a girl. Interestingly, I had a child ask me that question. Some years ago, I used to wear my hair very differently. It was very short. Maybe my dressing and my body language was a little bit different. And this 5-year-old child asked me, "Are you a girl or a boy?" And I didn't want to give her an answer, although I very much identify as female, and I've been raised female. But I didn't want to give her an answer. I wanted to see where this question came from, and she was a little bit troubled that she didn't have an answer. But her friends kind of helped her out, and they said she's Miss, so she's a girl. And the girl still didn't know why does she look like that. It's interesting if you think about it, because maybe the templates that we set for homosexual, heterosexual, male, female, they're so binary and so exclusive that they don't really encompass a child's wandering mind.
Before I proceed, I do want to say that in Enfold, we use the words male, female, intersex variations to refer to the sex of a person. And we use all other words, boy, girl, man, woman, trans, all of that to refer to the gender identity of a person. Try to box them in. And also, it's interesting if you notice that child was 5 years old. The one I said was 3 years old, because gender identity, we know, begins to form around this time. The children begin to feel what they feel inside with the presentation of various genders that they've been exposed to, and they begin to identify. And if things are going as per their theory, then they're fine. And then they meet a person who doesn't seem to be following this. So that's when they ask, right, what's happening here? So we can say that human beings feel differently inside. Some very, very clearly feel that they are woman inside, a girl inside, and they're happy to dress like the way girls usually dress today in this culture. Some the other way, and some may not be very clear, or some may be quite clear, but they don't want to follow the social norms or the rules that may have been set. It's absolutely fine to dress and wear and express yourself the way you want to, and it's good.
We spoke about expression in relation to how people dress and how they present in public, but this reminds us that it begins at the level of the body, how one stands and sits and looks around them and gestures, and all of these are learned behaviors, just the way we interact with other people and the way we occupy space. But there is a part of it that's maybe innate, that comes from someone's personality. So how do we make a space safe enough for people to both learn from the outside and express what is inside?
I would say that certain body movements would be innate, in the sense that the thrusting of the pelvis by the male during sexual activity. And here I'm not just thinking of humans, thinking of all various animals too. And the arching of the back of the pelvis towards the male by the female, those would be inherent. They would come naturally. Nobody would have to teach a person to do that. And that's what a couple was doing. They were having sex in between the thighs. right? They didn't know that it has to go inside, but everything else they knew. That is where some gender aspect may be in our biology, and a lot, of course, is learned. So we can have similar guidelines for all sexes, all genders. It really gets my goat when I see some men. They would be sitting on a sofa with their legs really, thighs really widely spread.
Man spreading.
It looks so indecent to me, right? So because if you have been saying we don't draw attention of people to these parts except when we want to, then why are you sitting like that in somebody's drawing room when you're having a conversation about something else altogether? Yeah, putting your legs together need not be taught just to the females.
And there's also presentation and movement outside of sexual acts themselves. Very pedestrian things like gait, like sitting, as you were just saying. And these seem so mundane and so innocuous, but there are so many stories of trans individuals being shamed, even attacked, just for the way that they carry their bodies, the way they wear their hair. Somehow there's a strong identification of these physical characteristics and choices with what's considered appropriate behavior.
And many times it's not even your choice. For instance, your gait, no, because it depends on the width of the pelvis, right? So males with a narrow pelvis make better runners, and females, because the pelvis is wider, our hip joints are further apart. So when we run, we kind of, it's like waddling in a way, because it's spread out and then it comes inwards. So some of it would be like that. The wider shoulders would give a better swing to the arms, whereas sometimes the breast may come in the way of swinging my arms. So these are very body related stuff, and I really feel we should stop judging people by these things. It's not a choice that they are making about these things. About their choice, about their behaviors, let us hold them responsible and accountable. That is where you can bring in all these things, but not something which is so inherent part of them.
I want to also bring up the matter of urban and elite spaces now somehow being perceived as the reason why India is having conversations about the queer community. This is a perception that maybe a lot of people hold, that queerness is a Western concept that's been imported into our country. Despite in the same-sex marriage ruling last year, although the courts did not actually finally allow same-sex marriage, there were many things in the judgment that were of interest. One of them was Chief Justice Chandrachud saying it's not queerness which is of foreign origin, but the many shades of prejudice in India which are remnants of a colonial past. So we're seeing that a lot of the binary thinking has really come from colonial law. And maybe if we look back deeper into more indigenous, more local narratives about gender and sex, we might find something different. And also if we decentralize the conversation from cities, we might find much more varied expressions of sexual identity and gender.
You're absolutely right there. Trans people, different sexual orientations are not something that came about yesterday or a century ago. They have always been a part of the human experience, just as they are a part of non-human animal experience as well. Why, even if you think of flowers, there are male flowers, there are female flowers, and then you have flowers that are both. There are various ways that sex has become a part of life. It's not only for reproduction, it is also for reproduction. Even small bacteria would two bacteria would come close together. One bacteria would send a pilus to the other and transfer a bit of its genetic material to the other. To me, it looks very much like sex. Of course, there is no reproduction after that, but it has helped in survival. So is it that sex also helps in survival? And we know it creates bonding, and we know it reduces stress. So there is much more to this story, and it has always existed, be it a rural area or an urban area, be it England, be it India. And in India, we have had a very long history of the Hijra community. And every local tradition has words, has groups that describe the community. Unfortunately, for a very long time, I don't know when it began, but even in India, we have been driving our different children out of our homes. If we have a Hijra community, why do we have it? All these children, all these people were born in some home. There is a mother, a father, a family which didn't want them, drove them away. So they came together and established themselves as a community. They have a very long tradition. They have rules about it. But I really wonder when it all began, when we became so intolerant and started throwing our own children out. Our temple architectures show us various kinds of sexual activities among various sexes. So it's certainly, I do agree that it's from a colonial past and probably from a very distant past. This discrimination has been coming in. Now the act about the protection of the rights of trans persons is, though it has, it could have been better, I believe, but it is a step towards the realization of the rights. The intersex variations, people need a different kind of protection because that child is really not looking at any gender affirming surgery at birth. The child doesn't even know. But right now the intersex variations are clubbed as trans. We do need to bring this into the mainstream and have our children grow up with us irrespective of their sex and gender, and our schools being inclusive. So this mother who wanted to adopt a child, and she went to the adoption agency, liked the child very much, and they said, no, not that child, leave that child. So she said, but why? Isn't the child, legally I can adopt the child here? Yeah, you can, but you may not want to because the child is intersex. And so the mom said, what? Doesn't this child deserve love, care? She adopted the child in Bangalore. And then as the child grew, she wanted to place the child in a school, and she was looking for a school where the child could be admitted. Because here, the issue is that the child may be dressed in a skirt and blouse, and then she may go into a girl's toilet, and that's fine because there is privacy in a girl's toilet. But what if the child is wearing a pant and shirt, goes into a boy's toilet? Every time, even to pass urine, there is no privacy, right? And also another question that the parents generally have to face is people asking, is it a girl or a boy, right? Is your baby? So we thought of these answers, and one could be, well, when the child grows up, the child will tell us whether it's a girl or a boy. For now, we are bringing up the child as a girl or as a boy, but the child will grow up. So isn't your child male, female? What the child is? No, the child has intersex variations. And that's it. So looking beyond the body, and first of all, recognizing each one of us as humans, deserving of equal respect and dignity and safety. If we can create that basic level of acceptance, right? That will be good.
So given that these changes sometimes manifest at puberty, and children might start to experience something that is not expected of the gender they were assigned at birth, how do we enable conversations around the intersex experience or even around the trans experience at adolescence?
the gender experience, if it is not cisgender, would become apparent from, say, 3.5, 4, 5 years of age. So the child will begin to say things like, I'm a boy inside, or I'm a girl inside. We did have a child in our family who was like, at 4 years of age, the child went to the mother and said, I've been combing my hair like this and I've been wearing a pant and shirts. And the child didn't have very many frocks. When will I become a boy? So that was one conversation. The mother explained that the body has certain chromosomes, and then because of those chromosomes, your body is like this. A trans child would be insistent, consistent, and persistent in their assertion that they are they feel a different gender inside. It's not the same as, sometimes a boy child may wear the mother's lipstick or her shoes or tie a ponytail. It's not the same thing. Here, what is differentiating is the insistence, the consistency, and the persistence. And as a child grows, and once the pubertal changes start, that is when dysmorphia can set in. I don't want these changes. What is this? Till now, I somehow managed with clothing. But ye kya ho raha hai? I don't want this. The insistence may increase now. So if there is no acceptance, if there is more fear of what people will say, rather than this is my child, I stand for my child. If I'm cisgender, it's not because I chose it. I was made like that by nature. My child is made like this by nature. We are both deserving of space here on this earth, and there is enough. So that's where it begins. Now with puberty, there is a lot of things that are happening, but we are not yet medically absolutely sure what to do. Nobody would like to operate on a 12-year-old child because you really don't know how the child is going to develop further. What may happen? I don't want to surgically remove something that I can't put back then. So surgeons would want to delay any any gender affirming surgeries, but until they're an adult, or maybe 16 at least. But the changes would have been completed at least in the females, right? In many countries, they may try puberty blockers. Okay, so they block, and these are all hormones, like they will block the release of those hormones and allow the mental development of the person, and then restart once the person has kind of decided. But it's not clear-cut either, because usually the brain develops under the influence of these hormones, and now you've removed them. So are you sure that what the person is saying now at 18 is what they really would have said if you had let things be? Now, a lot of the physical things, yes, we can take care of, like mastectomy, remove the breasts, making an artificial vagina, but we are not very good at making an artificial functioning penis. It is still a clumsy mechanical device, devoid of sensations. So would it be much better to keep the clitoris and maybe use sex toys to fulfill that male penetrative role? I really wonder. It may appear now that, there is a lot of noise around all this. There's so much voice. There's so many, placards and marches and petitions. It's thanks the ability to connect, thanks to the internet, which has made it possible for people with similar thoughts to come together, ask for their rights. Till now they were segregated, sent off separate. It's difficult. But now it's much easier to have a movement, right? And that's what we are seeing. And it's a good thing.
And that movement needs the support of all stakeholders, the families, the teachers, the medical community.
See, why is it a movement? Because it's not in everyday homes, every place. It's not there, right? That's why you have a movement. Why did we have a freedom movement? didn't have freedom, and it needs everyone. So it's our duty to inform ourselves, to educate ourselves, refer to authentic sources, well-researched sources. The other thing that may happen, which usually happens around puberty, is a sexual orientation. And that is when the person becomes aware that, hello, what is this new feeling? Whenever I see that person, my heart like wants to jump out of my chest and run to that. And if that is not what they have been brought up to see and told right from the storybooks, the little, very early books, which had a mother and a father of very different sexes and everything, and all the songs and the dance and everything is so binary. And this is what you're expected to be, hetero, and you're not. Or you just don't feel anything. You don't feel those kind of feelings, and you're like, what's going wrong? What's happening here? Everyone in my class seems to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. I'm just happy being a friend. Or maybe I just want romance, nothing else. Or maybe just companionship, little more than friendship. And then to feel that you are abnormal, that is the problem. No, this is as normal, as natural as things can be. And it is absolutely not fair, and in no case can bullying, teasing, taunting ever be called fair. But here there is so much taunting that goes on. So much taunting. Children would shun you, or during games, they will throw the football at you, or in the classroom where you were sitting till yesterday with your friend, today all of them are sitting one chair away because the word has spread that you are different. Why should I lose my child because somebody else's child, some other child in the school is unhappy with the way they are developing? I just don't get this amount of teasing and taunting that goes on in our schools. Of course, in our homes as well.
It kind of speaks to this societal question of the family structure, because one of the most common arguments against diversity in sexual orientation and gender is that it'll somehow break the structure of the family. And this is something I find puzzling, but I want to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, it is puzzling. Families, to begin with, were never the nuclear families. We always had lived in extended families. We lived in extended families that had different sexes, different genders, all living together. So there was no single person who was in charge of parenting the child. Everybody parented the child.
And you're referring to the pre-agricultural sort of
Even
setup.
agricultural. When I was growing up, at least our grandparents and one aunt was living with us. This idea of nuclear families is not according to our natural nature. And we are paying a huge price for it. Parents are burnt out.
Yeah.
They have to provide, they have to go out, get the food, come back, cook this, supply it to their children. It's very difficult. Everything you have to then, if somebody is coming in to take care of the child, you have to pay.
Thinking about diversity in gender and going back to that example that you shared about the mother adopting an intersex child, it actually makes us ask what values a family is based on. Is it based on inheritance and blood ties, or can it be based on something like compassion and respect? Very often for the queer community, it's a chosen family that becomes family because maybe they were rejected by their biological family. So it is a bit ironic to hear the argument that accepting diversity in gender and sexuality will break down the family structure, while actually it's sort of building up a new way of relating and a new way of forming families.
And this whole idea comes from that division of qualities, which is unnatural. Nature gives you all the qualities, all the human qualities, knowing full well that you will need all of them. But we bring our children up, oh, you're a girl, you should be caring, gentle, sacrificing. You're a boy, you should be demanding, bold, assertive. And don't mix these two, right? So now we are like, okay, the child needs both the parents to get a complete parenting. Hello. An example of this was in England. So they have this very strong social support system. And so there were these parents, heterosexual parents, who were addicted to alcohol, couldn't get enough food and all of that. And then their children were then, with their consent, taken for adoption. Okay. From the other side, this homosexual couple had applied for adoption. This child was given to them. When the biological parents found out that my child has gone to a homosexual parent, they wanted the child back. The thing went to court. And the judge said, you were not capable of giving food, love, care, attention to your children. The child was put up for adoption. Here are two people dedicating themselves to care for this child. The child will stay with them.
I'm Mrs. Gupta. I've been a special educator for over 15 years and have been out of the profession the last 2 to 3 years. And in my years of teaching in a co-educational classroom situation, children with special needs, I had an instance of a boy high on the spectrum, 15 years old. So this happened about 10 years ago. I found him frequently getting aroused in the classroom and quite unaware of what was happening, and could also sense the obvious and general discomfort of the other students in the class. So I tried by asking him whether he would like to go to the toilet. He went when I asked him to go sometimes. Sometimes he didn't understand why I had asked him to go and he would say no. And then I realized that he needed more help than I could offer him. Another thing I did do was every time I saw him having an arousal is I would ask him to take his shirt out of his trousers, untuck it. So that gave him a little more privacy, which he didn't understand but he needed. So I decided to call for a parent-teacher meeting because I felt the language he needed, I didn't have. I didn't know the terms his family used for genitalia and the vernacular language that they might have used at home for certain genitalia. So when the parents came, they were receptive to the situation. I suggested a couple of YouTube videos which the father could use for him to explain things for him, just to give him the respect and the privacy and to know that it's normal what was happening to him and not to make him feel uncomfortable in a classroom situation and with himself. In another instance, again a co-educational classroom situation, a boy about 16, very high on the spectrum. He came from a home where his parents had sensitized him and helped him understand what he was going through in as much as they could. And in the classroom, every time he had an arousal, there were instances when he was capable of saying no, no, and getting up and going out of the classroom. And there were instances where he was not aware of what was happening when his hands went under the table in the classroom. And I would just ask him, do you want to go to the toilet? And make him pull out his shirt once again and just gave him the time he needed in the toilet and then return to class.
So we come back to our basic needs, which are not really the need for a male and a female parent, but a more sort of inclusive, holistic kind of parenting, which gives the child the freedom to grow into whoever they want to be. We often think of sexual beings a certain way based on what we see in the media, also in our literature, including picture books, storybooks, fairy tales written for children. And aside from usually containing heterosexual couples or the promise of a heterosexual marriage and happily ever after. They also always have the able-bodied, and often anyone in a story that is disabled in any way, is living with a disability, is a kind of anomaly or even someone to look at with suspicion. I'm thinking of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a very old story, and it's quite tragic because this person can't live a normal life because of the way he looks physically, the way his intellect has not developed to match those of the people around him. But this is a reality, right? It is part of the society that we live in. We just don't have conversations about sexuality and disability.
Recently, Rising Flame, and that's an organization that works with disabilities, they have worked on this book, which has been brought out, called And We Lived ... Ever After. So it's common English language fairy tales retold with the disability, child with disability or a character with disabilities, beginning with the ugly duckling. You must buy that book and read it. Having said that, yes, disabilities and sexuality is quite an intersection. Both are very poorly understood. Both we try to avoid and, kind of silence and pretend it's not there, rather than accept. And also accept that disability can happen to anyone at any time. Yes, some of us may have it from childhood, maybe from birth, but anyone. And also it's how the environment is structured, which makes me abled or disabled. A huge building, tall building with no electricity and 40 flights of stairs. So sexuality, again, because of the word being enmeshed with sex, people feel that if a person has a loss of sensations in the genitals or can't approach the genitals because of some mechanical, physical issues, then they can't experience or satisfy their sexual needs. Besides the genitals, there are several non-genital areas of the body, which if we explored, we would find that they also carry some sexual arousal impulses, and people can experience an orgasm through these non-genital areas. You don't have to touch the genitals. In fact, you don't have to touch. A person can just imagine visually. And just by those visions, a person can achieve orgasm. So you don't have to touch. And then, of course, people have made and people do improvise and they use various props and ways to reach various parts of their bodies. We have had reports where parents have recognized this need of their children. Now, especially if the child has intellectual disabilities, their bodies are developing as chronologically, right? So their needs become very apparent. And we have had some very understanding parents who are supporting their child to masturbate. Now, if the child can't, then they are either doing it themselves or, getting some support so that the child can experience an orgasm. And all of this can be done in a very respectful manner. There is a word called the intention. With what intention are you touching the child? In child sexual abuse, that's the crux. Are you using the child for your sexual pleasure? Or are you supporting the child to satisfy their sexual needs? Maybe you are touching their genitals, but that touch is different from mutual masturbation, right? Or a child sexual abuse kind of thing. So it's what are you thinking when you're doing that for your child or for that person? In some countries, they would have people who would come in and do this. Like you have people come and give you physiotherapy, right? So it can be done in a very respectful, professional manner. And maintaining the dignity of all involved.
The question of consent, I think, becomes a bit complicated when it comes to cognitive disability. So how do we negotiate that?
Consent, if you watch the body language, it doesn't have to be verbal. In fact, my little baby granddaughter, even at 6 months, you approach the child, then you look at the eyes. What is she doing? What is she saying? Is she smiling back at you? When you extend your arms, is she extending her arms? When you come closer to her face, is she coming closer to you, or she is drawing herself away? So there are so many ways that a child with intellectual disabilities shows their
Can also
consent
communicate.
Yeah, they communicate, just like any non-human animal does.
That's very interesting because it moves the onus for consent away from, or rather, it doesn't make it just the responsibility of the person giving it, but it also places the responsibility on the person asking for it or receiving it, because it says, did I read their verbal and non-verbal cues, and did I truly give them a chance to communicate if they are happy or not with this engagement? And that's also it gives a very interesting perspective to consent in sort of able-bodied heteronormative or even non-heteronormative situations, because we have words, but we also have non-verbal cues.
And we have this idea in our heads that if I'm requesting you nicely, requesting you several times, then you should just
Say yes.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I keep telling people, hello, it's a request. Other person can refuse it. Doesn't even have to give any reason. So it's all fine when the other person is ready. But if the other person says, no, not now, later, maybe never, maybe whatever, how do you take it? So dissociated from it's a rejection of me as a person. No, at that moment, in that situation, in that context, the person doesn't want to maybe have sex with you or whatever you were asking. So you can respect that and thank the person for being open and communicate how they feel. And it's fine. Yeah, I really wanted it, but
It's okay.
it's okay. Yeah.
When it comes to disability and sexuality, another question that comes to mind is just, I think, for the people around to sort of perceive this person as a sexual being, which perhaps we just don't as a society, as a culture.
Yeah, we are we take the easy route. So if I find it difficult to talk about sexuality, I will just say my children with disabilities are not sexual, especially if they have intellectual disabilities, they're definitely not sexual. But at the same time, many members of our society would sexually abuse them.
A question that comes up when we think about disability and sexuality, also the sort of autonomy and self-determination of an individual with disability, is the right to marry, the right to be a parent. And yeah, we've seen sort of examples of these in the movies, but practically, one, is it something that we are aware of and we accommodate within our thinking of marriage and parenting? And two, how do we create the support for parenting when the parent lives with disability?
First of all, I would not call marriage and parenting a right. These are choices we make. Does a person with disability have the choice? Do they have the right to make a choice? Of course, they have. But again, disability is not one kind of disabilities. Yeah? There are so many under this umbrella. So, of course, it would need to be contextualized. Sometimes what we as gynecologists used to see is young girls with intellectual disabilities, hysterectomy is being done for them because then it becomes easier to manage their periods. Sexual abuse is very common, but now there won't be this added thing of pregnancy. So this is clearly a violation of their rights. And there are various menstrual management products, right, which can be used. Of course, it is cumbersome. And just as I was saying earlier, children are not meant to be brought up in nuclear or even semi-nuclear families nowadays. Similarly, having a child with disabilities, it would become that much more easier to support this person if we lived in an extended family. And also, in countries where nuclear families have become the norm, if there is a strong social support structure, government subsidies, government support, government-sponsored centers, life becomes much easier. India is caught in the middle, right? So we have nuclear families, but we don't have that much of a support. So by the law, yes, they have a right to get pregnant, to not abort the child, to have the child. Marriage, of course, depends. There's the other person, but there's no right as such over here that I have a right to get married. No, that no one has. You have to find a partner who's willing to be your partner and all of that. So also, it's interesting. Every time you think of it, so you have usual parents, one of them becomes disabled, both become disabled. What do you do with children? So it's like that.
If you think about it, when we age, in a way, we are all moving towards disability, because I've heard this from an elderly gentleman I know who said, walking on the streets is a young person's privilege, because I can't even navigate a pavement when half the blocks are missing, there's an open drain, the roads aren't level, and it's so painful just to make those movements in my knees to accommodate for that up and down, undulating surface underneath. And that's something that we don't necessarily understand until we have the experience of it. But also we won't all have the experience. We just need to perhaps anticipate that these experiences exist. And like you said earlier, disability is also determined by the environment we're in.
It's interesting because we consider elderly people to be disabled sexually as well, right? And we consider it perversion. If my 70-year-old aunt wants to live with a man now or wants to get married, we have had so many grown-up children resisting it, telling their parents, don't bring shame on the family.
It's a reversal of
Yeah. Now, if you do this, you won't get your share of the property. So many things. Okay, so, but just like children are sexual, so are elderly people. The nerves don't die away, the nerves remain. Of course, like any other, like muscles, if you're not been using them, they do become atrophic. So the genitals, of course, will atrophy even by themselves. But the clitoris, if it is not used, it may shrink too much and then become difficult to access. But it does not stop responding to touch and stimulation. And for the male, we often hear of that, 70, 80-year-old male has fathered a child and like that. What does happen in females is, of course, menopause. In males, it's not as drastic or as sudden. The levels of the hormones do reduce in size, in amount, and then the amount of semen production, the amount of sperms in it, all of that keeps reducing, but it persists into old age. The desire for sex may also reduce. So compared to a 26-year-old man or woman, a 86-year-old man or woman would have a far lowered sexual desire. But that is not to say that they are missing something. It's like, if you don't feel hungry, how do you miss food? You don't. So it's like that. So elderly sexuality needs to be accepted, respected, and made space for. We may begin to use other senses much more, especially touch. So, and that doesn't go away, right? So that ability to touch and feel the touch, and that hug and that companionship. So the colors of sexuality may change, but still remains colorful.
That's a great way to put it, because it comes back to what we've been talking about of sexuality as a part of human experience. It exists on the plane of human experience, and we keep separating it out of other experiences, and there's silence and there's taboo around it and there's shame around it. But if we look at it from the perspective of the lifespan of a human being, like you said, it takes on different shades at different stages in life, and there are age-appropriate ways of learning about it, and then there are experiences that change according to our life experiences. I also just want to spend a little time on menopause and what happens to sexuality after menopause, because I think there are a lot of ideas of women as sort of spent or past their prime, or just sort of sexually non grata. Like they don't really exist sexually anymore after menopause.
Correct.
But that can't be true.
Yeah, it's not true. It's again the confusion and the conflating sexuality with reproduction. So our organs, our systems still in medical textbooks are labeled as reproductive organs, but they are reproductive organs only for a short span in the life of people. So they are better called as sexual and reproductive organs. And this was brought out to me by Tharshe, an organization in Delhi. They were reviewing our Suvidha manual, and they pointed this out, and I thought it was beautiful. So we are sexual, we will remain sexual. Of course, with menopause, the reproductive capacities reduce, and the production of estrogen falls drastically. Also, testosterone levels fall. But other hormones like DHEA and other adrenal hormones are there, and the nerves are there, and the thoughts are there, and the fantasies are there. Maybe with time they have become even more refined and varied.
With experience.
Yes. It would be a different experience, for sure.
So maybe we can think of reproductive and sexual as having a distinction, with sexual experience as something that continues throughout life, and the capacity to reproduce as something that has physical limitations, particularly in the female body.
Yes. And yes, with menopause, the act of sex over time becomes more and more difficult, painful, because of the atrophy and the reduction in the size of the vagina. But vagina is one of the sexual organs. It is the main sexual organ is the clitoris in the female body.
This series was made possible with the generosity and knowledge of Dr. Sangeeta Saxena and the contributions of Abha Khetarpal, Dipankar Pant, Diya Naidu, Meghna Roy, Mitch Gupta, Nitya Devaya, and Saurabh Levin. We thank Vikram Bhatt and the team at the Bangalore International Centre for their support. Safe Spaces was produced by Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta. I am Anisha Tawag. Thank you for listening.